All right, so chapter 4 started with looking at the sole proprietorship and the partnership as two forms of business organization. The last one is the corporation. Um, Corporations are very interesting because literally you are creating a legal being under the law. You have to file paperwork with your state. Actually, you can incorporate it in any state, but the state actually is the one who has the say on whether to approve the corporation or not. But once your corporation is approved, it literally becomes its own. I mean, I would hate to say person, but it certainly is an artificial being created by law. It has tons of legal rights because it can own assets. It can enter into contracts. It can have debts, things like this. So it actually has many of the same rights as you and I as people, but it simply exists on paper. Okay, so corporations basically exist on paper, but under the law, they are looked at as artificial persons, artificial beings with legal rights. Okay. Corporations are basically, they only represent 18% of all businesses. So roughly 1 out of 8 businesses is a corporation. But they tend to be, we tend to look at, and we're very familiar with very large corporations. When you go to the mall and you look around, whether you stop at Target or you stop by Macy's or you stop by any of the other stores, they're corporations. They're corporations, and so they tend to do very, very well in terms of overall revenue compared to these very small businesses like sole proprietorships, which are numerous. There's a lot of them, but they simply don't have a large customer base like corporations do. So what makes a corporation different? It's really in the form of the ownership. In a sole proprietor, as you know, one person owns and operates the business. So you're the only owner. You are also the active manager. You run the thing, whatever you say, go. In the case of a partnership, like we mentioned last time, there are 2 or more owners, and they have to come to an agreement, right? That partnership agreement in terms of what their role is and how they're going to make decisions as owners. Well, corporations have ownership in the form of shares of ownership. And unlike a sole proprietor, which has 1 owner, or a partnership, which has 2 or more owners, corporations can have as many shares of ownership as they want to organize it. This is part of that paperwork you have to do with the state to get approved. And so shares of ownership and the word stock mean the same thing. Okay. So when you're looking at and you hear about the stock market, well, the stock market is basically where shares of ownership in corporations are bought and sold every day. That's the only thing, actually, that's the only thing that's on sale at the stock market is shares of ownership. And it's specific to the corporate form. So again, sole proprietorship, 1 owner, partnerships, 2 or more owners, corporations have shares of ownership. In New York State, for example, the minimum number of shares is 200. And the maximum is, you can have as many as you want. So you can have 200 million shares of ownership if you wanted. And so there's really no limit to the number of shares of ownership you have. So the person who owns these shares of ownership is a stockholder, also known as a shareholder. It's a terms are interchangeable. So if you own a share of ownership in a corporation, you're a stockholder. Okay, remember the synonymous shares of ownership is stock. That's when you and I look on the news and we hear about, Apple or Amazon or Facebook or whatever, those are basically what we call open corporations or public corporations. A public corporation or an open corporation the shares of ownership can be owned and purchased and sold by anybody in the public. So if you wanted to be a stockholder in Tesla, which is an open or public corporation, you simply buy a share of stock of Tesla on the stock market, and boom, you're a stockholder. You're an owner. You're a stockholder. It only takes one share, really. And so, but only in the reason that you and I can buy shares of ownership in those corporations is because it's open to the public. Most corporations, well, most, yes, that's not an option. Their ownership is closed. We call this a private corporation. This book calls it a closed corporation. They mean the same. Okay. And a private corporation or a closed corporation, basically the shares of ownership are owned by a very, very few people, and it is not available to the general public. So you and I cannot be stockholders in Mars. This is the candy bar, not the planet. So they make candy. They're a private corporation. They're a closed corporation, which means that their shares of ownership, their shares of stock, are not available to you and I as the general public to purchase. Unlike McDonald's, which is a public or open corporation, because you and I can be a stockholder in McDonald's because McDonald's has shares traded on the stock exchange. Public corporations or open corporations have shares traded on an exchange that you and I keep hearing about. Private corporations do not. They do not have shares that are traded on an exchange because the exchange are public markets, not private. Okay. Just one point of order for this, just to sort of understand these points here regarding President Trump. The Trump Organization is a closed corporation. It's a real estate company. It's a private corporation. It's owned by basically the Trump family, whatever family members have the shares of ownership, they own it. And typically speaking, you and I would never, ever know what happened in the closed corporation because we're not the owners. Only the owners know what the revenue of the company is, what the profitability of the company is, things like that, what the assets are, what they're valued at, things like this. So we really don't know when it comes to private ownership in a corporation what the value of those companies really, really are. And so you'll always get guesses, right? They'll always say Trump is worth somewhere between 3 and 10 billion. Well, they're guessing. They really don't know because they don't have a lot of data because that corporation is closed. It's a private corporation. Whereas we know exactly how wealthy Jeff Bezos of Amazon is. We know exactly how wealthy Mark Zuckerberg is of Facebook because they are the chairs of a public or open corporation. The shares of ownership is public knowledge. Their salary is public knowledge. Their share of ownership, that value is public knowledge. The number of shares they own times the stock price that you saw. We can easily calculate their real value, their real net worth. We can't do that when it's a private corporation. And this is the first time the country has had a a president who still has ownership in a closed corporation. And so it's posing a lot of questions as to should the president report out what that corporation or Trump organization has for profits and things like that. Under normal circumstances, it's nobody's business. I think the country's asking some good questions as to what do we do with a very, very public figure, can't get much more public than the president of the United States, and what that person might own and what that interests are. So I think it's a very good debate to have. I don't have an answer for you, but I just wanted to explain that the Trump organization is a closed corporation or a private corporation. And thus you and I would really never know, how it's doing in terms of profitability. All right. So certainly there's a lot of different tables in this chapter. One of the most important things, and I've always told this in my personal finance class, you're really going to need a few really good people in your life to help you over the long term. One of them is you're probably going to need a very good accountant that helps you with taxes and other types of issues like this. And another thing, you're really going to need a good lawyer. You really need a family lawyer is what I was talking about in that class. In this class, if you're in business, you're going to need a lawyer because you're going to be dealing with contracts. We learned that in business law, right? There are a lot of laws and that affect businesses in various ways. So you're going to need legal advice at some point in time. And if you're setting up any of these businesses, particularly a corporation, but you need a partnership agreement as well, but particularly a corporation, you're going to need legal help. So the paperwork that you need to fill out to submit to the state to become a corporation is one of those areas that you probably need legal help in. And that makes becoming a corporation relatively more complicated and more expensive than just deciding to be a sole proprietorship or even a partnership for that matter. So, there are costs that are involved and there's legal matters that need to be dealt with. Certainly as the corporation, as a business has, various things like a trademark or a patent or a copyright on an invention, that's going to require some legal help as well. So there's a lot of good reasons, but these are the sort of a top 10 aspects that would require legal help. All right, so in order to form a corporation, you actually have to apply. Okay, where do you apply? Well, at any state. Business law is a jurisdiction of the states, and so it's state law. You can apply in any of the 50 states. It doesn't really matter. Most people do just apply in the state that they're located at, but you're not legally required to do so. There are some states that have favorable corporate laws, like Delaware, for example, and so there's a lot of people that when they decide to create a corporation or form a corporation, they will apply in the state of Delaware, even if they're based, here in Poughkeepsie, New York, because that state has favorable rules for the corporate form. Okay. So basically, in terms of where it's at the state government, very specifically the Secretary of State's office in the state government, they have a corporations division, and they have the forms in which you need to fill that out. Okay. In many instances, we're basically going to be forming a corporation in the states. So that's a domestic corporation. And so that, again, part of it. But you can have what we call, different statuses. There's a foreign corporation, which basically is a corporation that does business in other states except the one it's incorporated in. So, for example, Sears, which owns Sears Holdings, which actually owns Sears and Kmart, or what's left of them, is incorporated in Delaware. Okay. Um, uh, where it is considered in Delaware a domestic corporation. But in all the other states, Sears Holding Company would be looked at as a foreign corporation. Okay. An alien corporation basically is a corporation that's chartered by a foreign government, so it was legally formed in another country, but they do business here in the States. So like Volkswagen or Samsung or a number of others. These are foreign corporations, but they do business in the States. So that's called an alien corporation. Okay. So basically what happens is once you apply, you have to fill out, there's a lot of different questions on the application. Once you apply and you get approved, that approval becomes your corporate charter. In other words, it's your birth. It's the birth of a corporation, the approval date. And so it becomes an artificial being, I like to call it, but an artificial person by law. And so, so that happens because your application gets turned into basically an article of incorporation, which is the contract between the corporation and the state that recognizes it. Okay. So if you apply to become a corporation in New York, and New York approves your charter, which is your application, then it becomes your articles of incorporation. It's the contract recognizing you as a corporation in that state. Okay. So again, some of these pieces of information that's on the application is a few of those you can answer yourself, but some you need a lawyer to do. And so I think that's one of the most important things is the application does have several areas that need to be addressed, and it's best to kind of get legal advice on that. So once a corporation exists, what part of that approval is the recognition of the number of shares of ownership in that corporation. And like I said, in New York, the minimum is 200. So if you went ahead, if I wanted to be not just, Mike the teacher, but I also wanted to be Mike the corporation because I was doing other things. Once I would fill out the form, I don't think I would need, I'm the only person involved in my little business. I do consulting, for example. 200 shares of ownership, which is the minimum, is fine. It's fine. I don't need any more than that because I'm the only owner. I'm the only person involved. So, so that's fine. But once I decide to actually sort of activate those shares, I have to sell them to investors. And since it's my company, I'm the only investor, I'm going to put money into the company in exchange for those shares of ownership. So companies basically start off with what we call common stock. And it's basically common ownership, common shares. And basically, common stockholders actually have a right to vote on certain decisions made by management. And so I would have, all companies have common stock. So if I were to issue any of my shares or sell any shares to me for putting money in the company to start it, those would be common shares. Corporations get big, they raise a lot more money, so they might issue or sell more common stock to raise that money. Some corporations say, well, actually, we'd like to raise money, but we do not want to give voting rights to the people who are becoming the new owners. And so preferred stock basically is raising money, ownership, stock is ownership. But these owners don't have any voting rights, which is different than the common shares. Okay. And again, generally speaking, most corporations, not just smaller, but most corporations only have common stock. Only about 8% of all the corporations that are listed on the stock exchanges, only 8% of them have any preferred shares, but 100% of them have common stock. So there are certain rights that shareholders have. Again, one of the basic rights is the right to vote on certain management decisions. The other, one of the more important rights is they have is a right to share in the profit earned by the company. So when a corporation earns money and they want to share some of that money, it doesn't make any sense to share all of it. When they want to share some of that profit with the owners, that's basically what a dividend is. So a dividend is basically a sharing of the profit. The word profit and the word earnings mean the same thing. Okay. So when they take part of the profit or the earnings and they share it with the stockholders, that's what a dividend is. Okay. The stockholders do have some other rights that are listed here. Again, they have to receive information that affects the corporation. They do have a right to vote on any changes to the corporation in terms of how it affects the charter. And they have a right to attend what's called an annual meeting, which is required by all corporations. And so those are some of the rights of common stockholders. There is something called, it's a legal term called a proxy, and it's a form of saying you can transfer your vote to others, and that's the form that's used. It's called a proxy. All right, make sure I'm on the right stage here. Yeah, okay. So every year corporations must hold an annual meeting, and even prior to that, what they have to do is the original owners have to create what's called corporate bylaws, and they elect something called the board of directors. So unlike being a sole proprietor where you're the owner of the company and you're also the manager, stockholders of corporations are just owners. They don't manage the company. So I'm a stockholder at McDonald's. I walk into McDonald's and my hamburger, I said no pickles, and there's pickles on it. I just because I'm a stockholder doesn't mean that I'm the boss and I can fire the person who put pickles on my hamburger. Although some people would be tempted to do so. That's not how corporations are organized. Owners, the stockholders, are represented by a board of directors. The board of directors is there to hire the upper management and to set goals, big goals, to make the company profitable. So I have voting rights for these folks. I vote for representation on the board of directors for people that are going to make sure that as a stockholder, as a shareholder, I'm going to get wealthier over time. That's their job. Okay. So board of directors are, in essence, directly responsible to the owners of a corporation. All right. As we mentioned here, Board of directors, this is the top group. It is the top governing body of all corporations. Um, and, again, they're elected by common stockholders. And basically, they have to set goals for the company. They also hire the upper management folks to get things done, and that's their job. So typical officers of a company include the chairman of the board, president of the company. There's a ton of executive vice presidents. There's usually a corporate secretary, treasurer, and some other folks. And again, they are supposed to help the board make these big plans to make sure things are done. These goals that are set are met. So if I was on the board of directors of, say, Pepsi, um, Pepsi's a smaller number two in the soft drink business. Coke is just ginormous. But if I was on the board of Pepsi, one of the goals I could help set is we're going to take away 1% market share from Coke over the next 3 years, 1% per year, so 3% in total. Well, 3% market share could mean, hundreds of millions of dollars in sales to the company. And that also could mean millions and millions of dollars of profits to the owner. So that would be a good goal to set. But as a board of director, I'm not going to be actually doing that. I'm actually going to be hiring the upper managers, we call it corporate officers, to make sure they get all that stuff done. Make sure that they're putting in place plans to take away market share away from Coca-Cola every year, 1% a year over 3 years, so 3%. It seems like a small number, but it's a huge, it represents a huge number in dollars. Small percentage, but big dollars. So that's how it works. Stockholders elect a board of directors to represent their interests. Board of directors set those goals. They hire the officers. They call it appointment, but it's really a hiring of the top management. And then top management goes ahead and hire all the employees to get that work done. So that's basically how the corporate structure works. Every form of business has advantages and disadvantages, and corporations actually have several advantages. The biggest one is what's called limited liability. As an owner, which means you're a stockholder of a corporation, the most you can ever lose, the most you can ever lose is your investment. So if you put $10,000 into a corporation and the corporation's out of business, that's the most you can lose, the $10,000 you put in. Unlike sole proprietorships or partnerships where it's unlimited, it's more than what you can put in. One of the other big advantages of being a corporation is you can just simply issue more shares of stock to raise money, ask for more owners to put more money in. And that basically is what we call the ease of raising money on the market. Okay. One of the wonderful things about a corporation is the ownership and the management are separate. And so the ownership of a corporation can change all the time without affecting how the company is run. For example, if a sole proprietor sold his or her ownership to another owner, then that's it. Everything changes in that business because the new owner is probably going to have their own way of looking at things and doing things. So everything is going to change. In a corporation, that doesn't happen because the ownership and the management are separate. So everything is running normal at your local Walmart or Chipotle or whatever. Even though there's millions of shares of ownership traded every day on the stock market in those companies, doesn't matter. The ownership doesn't affect the management of the company, and that's a big advantage. Corporations can outlive the people who start them, and so Walt Disney, I know he's either frozen or on ice or whatever, right? but he's been dead for some time, and but the corporation he started is bigger than ever. I don't think he would recognize it if he did come back or he got defrosted or whatnot. Um, I don't think he would recognize his own company at this point. It's so huge. It's so huge. Uh, Steve Jobs did start Apple, started Pixar, um, started a couple of companies actually, and of course, sadly, he's passed early. And but of course, Apple is the biggest corporation we have in terms uh, of stockholder value, well over $1 trillion. And Pixar was bought by Disney for I think a couple of billion at least, and it's doing quite well. So the perpetual life is corporations can last a long, long time. And corporations can actually, because they're so big, they need specialists. Someone who knows manufacturing, someone who knows finance, someone who knows marketing, things like that. So they can hire specialized management to get that type of stuff done. That doesn't happen in a very small business. You can hire a consultant in a small business, but here you can actually have those folks working for you. And of course, there are disadvantages. No surprise, right? It is more difficult and expensive to actually become a corporation than the other two options, sole proprietorship or partnership. Most laws that are passed particularly out of Washington, but certainly out of the state, are targeting more of the corporate form than sole proprietors and partnerships or those much smaller businesses that are there. So these regulations overwhelmingly form um, extra costs and extra paperwork for corporations. Um, Certainly, there's always conflict. That happens in every form of business, I think. This is an interesting issue called double taxation, and that means that if the corporation makes a profit, those profits are taxed. And if the corporations send a little bit of that to the stockholders in the form of a dividend, well, that's also taxed. So they call that double taxation. Okay. And of course, if you're a public corporation, there certainly is a lack of secrecy because um, open corporations are required to submit detailed reports on various things that are going on. And so everybody knows there's no secret. All right, so in terms of this particular table, the advantages and disadvantages of your sole proprietorship, partnership, and a corporation are listed. Now, this is a corporation in general is considered a C, and so it's just a regular corporation for profit, no problems. As you see in terms of the issues that are listed here, sole proprietors have some difficulty in some issues, some ease in others. As you see, corporations have a little bit more in terms of ease in dealing with some of those things, but difficult in some others. All right, some special forms. So there's something called an S corporation, which basically is a corporation, but it's taxed like a partnership. And so partnerships are taxed when the company has a profit. It's distributed to the owners, the partners, and then they put that on their individual tax, and they start at a much lower rate. Corporate tax rates start at 21%. Individual tax rates, which partnerships pay, start at 10%. So an S corporation allows this to work as a corporation, but any profits are taxed as individual rates. But there are some limitations. The biggest limitations is you can't have more than 100 stockholders to be an S corporation. Okay. And you must be a domestic corporation to file. There's only common stock. There's no other people that are involved. So it's definitely an effective way to manage the tax issue with the benefit of the limited liability. Um, and that's typically the only choice that we had when I was growing up, in terms of if you didn't want to be a corporation, uh, but you wanted the benefits of the corporation, you could be an S. But government states have gotten quite creative over the last 30, 40 years, and they've been producing hybrids. I would say a hybrid because it's a hybrid. It's a part corporation, it's part partnership. Um, and so one of the hybrids they came up with was called an LLC, a limited liability company, which again gives you that's the benefit of the corporation, which is limited liability, but it has some of the benefits of a partnership. So many partnerships decide that, look, if we form an LLC because we have several partners in this business, if one of those partners seems to do something really off, well, then the other partners in a limited liability partnership are are covered. They're not liable for in essence, for the sins of the perpetrator. So it's these are popular forms. So LLCs, LLPs. There are several other examples. Um, BMW of North America is actually probably one of the, if not the biggest LLC in the country. Um, and again, there are some advantages, that taxation advantage, the limited liability advantage. And LLCs have fewer restrictions than S corporations, okay, because they can have more than 100 stockholders, and so there's room to raise a lot more money in the future. So here's your C corporation, here's your S, and here's your LLC. And again, this chart or table tells you pluses and minuses. But believe it or not, you can be a not-for-profit corporation. You can actually create a not-for-profit corporation. So again, and this says it's not-for-profit. So a C corporation, an S corporation, LLC, those are, the purpose of their existence is to make a profit, to sell a product or service or both, to make profits. But some organizations do not have that as their main goal. They seem to be mission based. They have a social mission, they have an education mission, they have a religious mission, or some other mission. That's their main goal. Profit is not their main goal. The mission it is. And so they can apply to become not-for-profit corporations. And they do. Charities are not-for-profit corporations, museums, schools, colleges, churches, and others. They're all nonprofit corporations. And so, again, the reason why they want to become that is to make sure that the organization has the benefit of limited liability. Right? And that's really the big reason. Your book talks about joint ventures and syndicates. They're basically very similar type of thing. So a joint venture is basically a contractual agreement between two or more businesses or groups that form a business entity to reach a specific goal, or they operate for a specific time and then that's it. And so recently, General Motors announced a joint venture with, I think it's called Nikola Transportation, to make to do like electric trucks. We have electric cars. This is for electric trucks. That's a joint venture. Once they actually do produce the battery and other things that they have agreed to work on together, then it's done. Okay, so again, joint ventures are totally dissolved once the goal is reached, or in the case of a period of time, it's done. Syndicates are also associations that are temporary. And basically, they want to do something that requires a huge amount of money to do. And so, for the most part, we always look at investment banking as a syndicate, a perfect syndicate, because when a company wants to go ahead and raise money, they're going to go to an investment banking firm like a Goldman Sachs or a JP Morgan or a Morgan Stanley or whatever to help raise money. Oftentimes, stock issues, what we call initial public offerings, bond issues, are done by syndicates, a temporary association of investment banking companies to help raise money, a lot of money for a particular company, and then it's done. And it's done. Again, as soon as the goal is done is achieved, syndicate's done. Okay, and so that's actually how Wall Street works. It is basically from syndicates. Corporations are really focused on growth. And so, in other words, they want to get bigger in different ways. The most popular way that they grow is they sell more of their stuff. They expand their territory. They expand the operation. So they are selling newer products or related products. They are expanding to different geographic areas or geographic customers. They have new customers coming in. And that's the perfect way in which companies want to grow. They are selling more of their stuff to more and more people. Okay, it's a beautiful thing. However, it's not the only way to grow. You can grow by, well, you can buy another business. That's called an acquisition. It's when one company basically buys another company. Um, or you can decide that two companies that are separate now should merge into one big company, and boy, we could really go places. So a merger is simply the combination of two corporations to form one new corporation. um, and so basically speaking, they're looking to grow, they're looking to get bigger. This happened in the banking industry quite a bit, particularly in the 80s, where they thought the banks, we were getting more globalized as an economy, and the banks in America, as big as we thought they were quite small compared to European banks and Japanese banks and others. And so they thought the best thing to do is to start merging or combining so they can get bigger and bigger and bigger, and thus they can compete with all these international banks in a globalized economy. So that happens. It happens in a lot of other areas as well. A big merger that happened in your lifetime was Exxon and Mobil, getting together. That was a huge merger. They were two separate companies, but they combined into one. Now, usually, and again, the acquisition here is just simply, it says it's essentially the same thing as a merger, but in most cases, an acquisition is a purchase. It's a purchase. Most mergers are agreed to. One company will agree to it. Actually, a lot of acquisitions are agreed to as well, because it does seem to be in the best interest of the owners to be bought by another company. The problem becomes, how do you pay for that when one company buys another or one company merges with another? How do you pay for that? Well, one thing that can happen, it doesn't always work out for folks, is they can borrow a ton of money to buy another company. Um, and that's called a leverage buyout. And this is what happened to Toys R Us. Toys R Us was actually a subsidiary of a bigger company, and their parent company basically went under. And then they became the parent and they bought everything. Um, they bought it through debt. They bought it through debt. And so leverage, every time you hear the word leverage, it's the use of debt, use of debt. And so they borrowed a ton of money. They did grow for a while. They were able to manage all of that, and then eventually it all crashed. Right. The reason why Toys R Us is no longer with us um, is they just had way too much debt. Yeah. And then, of course, you have companies that buy other companies that don't want to get bought. So sometimes that happens. And so when one company buys another company that doesn't want to get bought out, that's called a hostile takeover. What's hostile about it is the management of the company and the board of directors of the company that's being targeted. They don't want to do it. And sometimes the stockholders, because there's a lot of money in it for them, force the hand. Yes, we want this to happen. And so it tends to be sort of a hostile takeover. Ultimately, the stockholders have to vote on it. So if the common stockholders say, yeah, we want to get taken over because they're giving us $100 for my share, for every share of ownership. And, years ago, I only bought these for $10, so now they're 100. Yeah, definitely. I'll sell. I'll sell it to them. Ultimately, the owners have this final say. So when mergers happen, there's three different types of mergers that are listed in the book that are important to know. The horizontal and the vertical are easy to understand because they basically are, in this case, a horizontal merger is a merger between two companies that sell basically the same types of services. And so in your book talks about um, Dow Chemical and DuPont, which is another chemical company. They both merged. And so that's basically, in this case, these companies make and sell the same types of products. And so that's a horizontal merger. A vertical merger happens when one company merges with another company that has um, different but related product lines to them. So Microsoft purchased a London-based company called SwiftKey. They make that predictive keyboard powered by artificial intelligence. Well, Microsoft was going to develop one, but then they saw this company had it and it was doing well, and they decided to buy it. The price tag, by the way, was $250 million for that company. But these tech giants have a lot of money on the books. And so, they that's another way to grow is you buy a company that already has their products. Um, Disney did the same thing to pick up a vertical merger. Um, they went ahead and they purchased Star Wars, Lucasfilms, and then prior to that, a few years prior to that, they purchased all of Marvel stuff as well. They needed more characters. They needed more characters. Um, and a conglomerate merger basically is companies that buy other companies in completely different industries. Um, and that's basically companies like, a lot of folks have heard of Warren Buffett and, how wealthy he is because of his company, Berkshire Hathaway. But Berkshire Hathaway is just a big conglomerate. They're a holding company. They own a lot of other companies. So they own Aflac, for example, and they own Geico. They own a bunch of other companies as well. Um, so it's basically non-related. They might own banks. They might own retail companies. They might own manufacturing companies. They're just not in the same. But that's what a conglomerate is. Okay. Oh, and then they have things right here. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Some examples. Yay. Of course, in the future, I mean, again, there are advocates and opponents of this way of growing. I personally, I just think it's going to continue to go. It's going to continue to grow. Um, And that's because we have, you have companies like Apple, you have companies like Microsoft, that have literally billions and billions of dollars in cash. They literally have billions and billions in cash right now. Um, some estimate is they all corporations have somewhere in the realm of about $2 trillion in cash right now. That can buy a lot of other companies when the time is right. And so I think this is going to continue to happen. And usually, I think the best thing is for them to grow uh, vertically, to sort of spread their wings with associated products that help them grow. I think you will see a lot of things like that in the future. And that, my friends, is the show.